Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Gizmo Joe. Today we're going to be taking a look at my Arcade1Up cabinet. As you can see, it is the Street Fighter II Championship Edition cabinet, the Arcade1Up. Now, I apologize if my voice sounds a bit rough. I have been a bit hoarse. I came down with a bit of a bug. Probably from some of my students, but you know, what can you do? Anyway, let's get right to it. So those of you who have been watching this channel for a little while know that I picked one of these up ages ago, and my intention was to essentially mod it to play more than just the 3 games that it comes bundled with. So if you buy one of these cabinets, they're like a 3/4 size. You got to sit down at them at a bar stool, or you can try to fashion a riser. I know in the States that they make risers and they're pretty cheap, but haven't found any in Australia other than on eBay for exorbitant amounts of money. But anyway, what I wanted to do was replace the joysticks and the buttons out, and I did that. So I picked up a button kit on eBay, and they're like Sanwa buttons, but they're actually not Sanwa buttons, so they're like kind of like knockoffs, but they're pretty good. They light up. I did not wire mine to light up though, but these ones definitely do light up, and the joysticks are better quality. So if you watch my video on the review of this particular unit, I said that the buttons felt sort of cheap and the joysticks felt sort of cheap, and I said that probably with any sort of prolonged usage you probably find that they wouldn't last. So I wanted to swap those out. So again, I bought a button and joystick kit. It was only about 50 bucks Australian, and I swapped all that out. Now I will say this, I basically followed the YouTube guide by a YouTuber by the name of ETA Prime, who is pretty popular. I'll leave a link down in the description for the video that I followed, but basically if you're curious as to how I did all this, I basically just followed his guide, got what he recommended, did everything basically exactly the same. But anyway, like you can see, I've just swapped out the buttons. Now there is one main sort of modification that I did have to make to this, and that is I added buttons. Now in the ETA Prime version, he added buttons right to the top of his board so that they were right next to the 1-player and 2-player button. I chose not to do that. I actually put mine on the sides, and I'll show you that in just a second. Okay guys, so as you can see, like I said, I replaced the joysticks and the buttons on this particular unit, but because I wanted to essentially run RetroPie and MAME and all that good stuff, we actually needed to add an extra button. Now in the ETA Prime video, he put his buttons right up top here, so he took a step drill bit and he put his buttons here. I chose to put mine on the side just because, I don't know, I felt like it was just a bit out of the way. It looked a bit cleaner, less cluttered up on the main top bit. So anyway, so I have one button here and one on the other side. So obviously the red button corresponds with the first player, and then I have a blue button over on the other side that corresponds with the second player. So the way that this works, when you're playing games, or at least when you're playing MAME games, so your arcade games, you would hit this button here to insert a coin, and then you would hit player 1 start in order to get the game going. Now when you want to back out of something, whether this is Nintendo or Game Boy or arcade games, you have to actually hit the player 1 start and this button here, and that is essentially your hotkey. So that bounces out of whatever you're playing. But anyway, so it's pretty self-explanatory, and it was pretty easy to wire up. So again, I won't actually show you how I wired all this up. It's pretty basic, and I'll leave a link down in the description again so you guys can watch that ETA Prime video. He does a better job than I ever could, so props to him for sure. But definitely check that out if you're looking to do this mod yourself. What I'll quickly do is I'll swing around to the back of the machine so you can have a look at the parts that I used, and I'll kind of point everything out quickly before we fire. Okay guys, so this is the inside of my Arcade1Up cabinet. Now it looks a bit messy, but just bear with me. I'll basically go from the top down and point out everything that I did. So basically what you're looking at here, this silver rectangular bit, that's the actual monitor. Now originally when I had the Arcade1Up, there was a board that was basically just mounted to the back of the screen. And that's basically the whole game ran from there. And there was a ribbon cable that ran underneath to where the joysticks and stuff are. So what you need to do if you want to pull off this mod is you got to take note of that number right there. That's the serial number of the sort of screen it is, and get an LCD controller board that matches that particular number, or that's compatible with that particular number. What an LCD controller board does is it essentially gives you all of the different ports that you'll need. So for instance, HDMI, it also has DVI and VGA. So you could stick like a whole old, like, basically computer tower in here if you wanted to run something that is even capable of even more stuff. But I opted for something a little different, even a little different to what basically everybody else on YouTube is doing. Everybody else on YouTube basically is running the Raspberry Pi 3. I opted for something a little bit cheaper, and we'll get to that in just a second. But on the left here, you can see my amp. I'll talk about how that works in just a second. But let's keep going down so you can see, again, this whole mess of cables down here. So now, for those eagle-eyed viewers, you'll notice that this is basically my Raspberry Pi Zero. I'm running a Raspberry Pi Zero for this entire setup. So the Raspberry Pi Zero obviously is less powerful than the Raspberry Pi 3, but I had one laying around. I had an extra 32 gigabyte card, and basically all I wanted to do was run a lot of 2D games on this machine anyway. I didn't think that, I wanted to play, PlayStation 1 or Sega Saturn games or GameCube games, because to me, they just don't feel right with a joystick. You kind of want a controller, because those are console games and that's what they were sort of designed for. So again, I wanted to just basically run 2D games. So I figured the Raspberry Pi Zero would be more than enough for what I needed. Problem with the Raspberry Pi Zero is that you need a whole slew of extra cables. So you need a USB hub, and for me, what I did, because essentially when you swap out the buttons and everything, you're going to need to wire all of your buttons to a USB encoder, and that USB encoder then feeds into your Raspberry Pi. That way, your inputs from the joysticks and the buttons can translate to something that the Raspberry Pi Zero can understand. In my case, I needed to get a powered USB hub because, simply put, the Raspberry Pi Zero just did not supply enough power. If you opt for a Raspberry Pi 3, that should supply enough power directly to those USB encoders. You won't have that problem. But anyway, so that's why my inside of my cabinet looks a bit of a mess, because I have a lot more cables than other people need. Now you'll notice that I used a plethora of electrical tape here in order to anchor everything down, and that was just so that nothing sort of slid around if I had to move it around. Anyway, that's basically it. So that's the big difference between my Arcade1Up machine and basically everybody else on YouTube. I am using a Raspberry Pi Zero, and I've been really, really happy with the results. And when I fire this up and show you guys, give you some demos, I think you'll be impressed as well. But anyway, let's quickly take a look back at this big blue thing here. So this is an amp. So this amp essentially allows me to output sound from the Raspberry Pi into the stock speaker. So the Arcade1Ups, they come with a built-in speaker. That speaker is, fine. You can put your own speakers in there if you want better sound quality, but I just wanted something cheap, or as cheap as I could possibly do it. So basically what I did was, again, following ETA Prime's example, these white wires back here are to the internal speaker. So I stripped those wires and I plugged them back into the amp. All right, now the amp has its own power supply, which again increases the amount of cables that I have, but it's also got a 3.5 mil input jack in the back, which is what this cable is. So if we follow this cable up over here, you'll notice that it plugs straight into this LCD controller board. So essentially what you have is, and let's pan back down here. So if you look at my Raspberry Pi Zero, you'll notice that there's the HDMI. So that's obviously outputting the video, but it's also outputting sound. So the HDMI is delivering the video and the sound to the LCD controller board. So again, there is your video and your sound. But now the sound has nowhere to go here until you plug in this 3.5 mil jack. So when you plug in the 3.5 mil jack, the sound signal from the Raspberry Pi goes to that 3.5 mil jack. It goes all the way down into the amp, which then feeds it into the internal built-in speaker that came with the unit to begin with. Now, obviously, if you have a Raspberry Pi 3, that has its own sort of speaker jack or 3.5 mil jack, so you can just plug in computer speakers or something if you want, bypass this whole amp situation. But that's just a cheap amp that I got on eBay. I think I got it for about 12 bucks, so it just worked out to be a heck of a lot cheaper for me anyway. So, again, it's not pretty in the back, but once I put the back panel back on here, you won't be able to see it at all. And everything's sort of anchored down, hopefully with that electrical tape, so nothing should slide around. And it was all pretty cheap. So, again, all said and done, the most expensive part were the buttons. They were about 50 bucks. I already had a step drill bit. You can get those from, depending on what country you live in, Bunnings or Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever you are. Just go to a hardware store, step drill bits. They make perfect circles. They're pretty cool. The LCD controller board, I want to say, was only about 30 bucks. The buttons were about 50. This amp was about 12. Raspberry Pi Zero, I get mine for about 10 bucks. And then obviously all the cables and stuff. I had most of them lying around already anyway, so I didn't have to spend any money there. I want to say all up, I probably spent, about 150 bucks doing this mod. So I got the cabinet for about 300, and all the parts necessary to do the mod was about another 150. But I'm really, really happy with what I came up with, and I'll show it off in just a second. So stick around. I'll fire this guy up so that you guys can have a look and see what it's capable of doing. Okay guys, so I've just booted up my Arcade1Up. You'll notice the Raspberry Pi symbol up in the corner. So obviously it's booted up. The LCD controller board is doing exactly what we need it to do. And just give it a sec. And again, we're getting sound out of the internal speaker here, and that's thanks to that little amp. It's that little cheap amp that I got on eBay for about 12 bucks. So this is running RetroPie, obviously. Some people ask, where do you get the ROMs? ROMs are a legal gray area, so I'm not going to leave any links for any. But Google is your friend in this scenario, so have a look around, see what you can find. Anyway. So I'll just quickly scroll through all of the systems that my Raspberry Pi Zero in my Arcade1Up cabinet is capable of doing. So I have arcade games. There's 352 of them. I have Atari 2600. You're looking at 526 games there. Looking at Atari 7800. There's 64 games available there. The Atari Lynx, that's 76 games. Game Boy, 475. Game Boy Color, $385. Game Boy Advance, $499. Nintendo, $696. Super Nintendo, $707. Sega Master System, $273. Sega Mega Drive, or Sega Genesis if you're in North America, $351. Sega 32X, there's 36 games available. Sega CD, you got 8 games. TurboGrafx 16 or PC Engine, you have 101. And that's it. So that's the whole collection. So I want to say there's about 2,000-ish games, maybe even more than that. I'm not sure. I haven't actually added them all up. But basically, it runs pretty much all of these systems fine. So what you'll notice is obviously I don't have any 32-bit systems. Unless you want to count the Sega 32X, which, I don't count it, but maybe you do. But basically, they're all from the 16-bit era. That's pretty much what the Raspberry Pi Zero is capable of doing smoothly. So I've tested, obviously not every single game, but I've tested quite a few of them, and all of them run really, really well. it's a bit weird playing console games on a joystick and a 6-button arcade configuration, as I mentioned earlier. But, you know, you can play things like Mario Brothers and stuff like that alright, because they're fairly simple. But anyway, let's jump into some games here. Let's just go to arcade. You know, so obviously I've set it up so that it's got all of the metadata on all these games, which is pretty cool. Let's play Aliens, because that's, you know, one of my favorite film series of all time. And you know, it's sort of a forgotten classic in my opinion. A lot of people don't even realize that Aliens was an arcade game. Well, here you go. So obviously, you know, MAME sometimes needs to be configured properly. You need to configure your controller separately and everything like that. So you can Google all that stuff. But again, we're getting sound from the internal speaker. I'll just pan down here so you guys can see. So again, the speaker is here, and we're getting sound out of there. Now these two switches are disabled. They do nothing. I've totally disabled those. So now, when I want to put a coin in for this particular game, I reach to my side button, as I mentioned before, and I press that. And it's putting coins in for me. If I hit player 1 start, I'm ready to go. Let's skip all that. We don't need any of that. Alright, we got Ripley here with the long gun. I don't think she actually uses that in the movie, but that's beside the point. Got the little face huggers. And, you know, it's basically a side-scrolling shoot 'em up. Pretty cool sound effects, but it runs well. Now, I want to back out of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the start button and my coin insert button at the same time. It backs out. Good to go. And basically you can choose a new game. If I want to, you know, let's take a look at something else. Let's say you want to play, I don't know, what do you guys like? Mario Brothers? I don't know. I even got ROM hacks on here, if you can believe it. So you go in here, I got, you know, all this stuff. But anyway, that's beside the point. Now, I've got almost every single Nintendo game here. So just give me a second. Let me try to find... so let's just do Super Mario Brothers. It's a classic. Again, a bit strange playing it with a joystick, in my opinion. But I guess that's just what I'm used to. And there you go, Mario Brothers. So like I said, I've tested most of these games. They all seem to work. See, I'm not very good with the joystick. I find myself floating all over the place. But let's back out of here. Let's play something. Let's go to something in the 16-bit era, just so you guys can see what the little Raspberry Pi Zero is capable of. Let's do something in the Sega Mega Drive. I guess we could do Sonic, right? Everybody loves Sonic. You know, one of my favorite Sega Mega Drive games is one that... Actually, let's do Streets of Rage. I love Streets of Rage. One of my favorite games is a little-known game. I guess it's an arcade game first, but it's called Gain Ground. Love that game. Still play it to this day. My partner, she even knows the song. Whenever I fire up a game, and you know... It's one of the few that she can pick just solely by the music. Alright, let's go. One player. Here we go. Now, I was always a Blaze guy because she was a bit faster. Not the strongest, but she can move around the screen faster, which I appreciated. Axel and Max, they were just too slow. Skate, he was fast, but, you know, he was so weak. So as you can see, it plays it really well. Let's back out of that. And it even does 32X games really well. I mean, you know, not that the 32X was all that complicated, but I mean, I have come across a few games that you try to launch them and they back straight out, and that's because they're just crashing immediately. But you know, a lot of these games do work. Like if we do Final Fight, you know, it's even got the full motion video. It's got the sound that the Sega CD was known for. So I mean, the Raspberry Pi Zero more than capable to be used in one of these Arcade1Up machines. Like I said, the only thing that you really have to be careful of if you want to use a Raspberry Pi Zero is you have to have a powered USB hub, because basically you need to deliver power to the USB encoders that power the buttons and the joystick. If you just have a standard USB hub, it's not going to supply enough power because the Raspberry Pi Zero just doesn't do it. Anyway, here you go. You guys can listen to that amazing audio, the amazing voice acting of Final Fight CD.
And former Street Fighter Mike Haggard plans to change. At the center of the problem is the huge gang known as Mad Gear. Mad Gear controls all of the major criminal activity in the city.
It's fascinating stuff. Anyway, so let's back out of this. And, that's going to do it for me today, guys. Thanks for watching. I know this has been a project that has been a long time coming. I got my Arcade1Up months ago. It's taken me a really long time to do this, but that's just because I've been waiting on parts, and then, life gets in the way. My partner's been screaming at me because stuff has been sitting all over the floor for weeks on end, but I finally managed to get everything put together. There was a few hiccups here and there, but that was basically just, mistakes on my part, where, I wasn't plugging something in correctly or whatever, and I kind of had to do a little bit of trial and error to get it working. But like I said, if you are interested in doing this, definitely check out ETA Prime. He was the one that I followed in order to get this up and running. It was incredibly accurate. And like I said, all of the mistakes were my own mistakes, not necessarily his fault. So if you follow him to a T, you should have no issues whatsoever. Anyway, so that's my Arcade1Up modded with a Raspberry Pi Zero. It plays, like I said, over 2,000 games. And it's pretty cheap. If you can get your hands on an Arcade1Up machine, definitely do it. And if you can swing another $150, maybe even cheaper if you can find the parts cheaper, it's well worth it. It's super cool, and I have to admit, all of my friends are envious that I have one of these in my home. So that's going to do it for today. Thanks for watching, guys. I will catch you next time. This is Gizmo Joe signing off.